What if I told you that one of the most influential museums in America was designed by architects who spent decades arguing that less is a bore, deliberately broke every modernist rule in the book, and turned a city block in downtown Seattle into a manifesto carved in limestone and terracotta? Welcome back to UrbArchitect, where we explore the buildings that shape our cities and challenge our assumptions about what architecture can be. Today we're diving deep into the Seattle Art Museum, a postmodern landmark that opened in 1991 and proved that ornament, symbolism, and a healthy sense of irony could coexist with serious architectural ambition. Designed by Venturi, Scott Brown and Associates, this building isn't just a place to look at art. It's a deliberate, provocative statement about the role of museums in American cities, the power of architectural communication, and the ongoing debate between modernist purity and postmodern complexity. So buckle up, because we're about to unpack one of the most intellectually rich and visually striking museum buildings of the late 20th century. And trust me, there's a lot more going on here than you might think at first glance. The Seattle Art Museum sits at the corner of First Avenue and University Street in downtown Seattle, occupying a prominent site that slopes dramatically from the city's commercial core down toward the waterfront and Elliott Bay beyond. When it opened its doors in December 1991, it represented not just a new home for Seattle's growing art collection, but a bold architectural bet on postmodernism at a moment when that movement was already facing skepticism and critique. The architects, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, were by that point already legendary figures in American architecture, having spent the previous 3 decades systematically dismantling the dogmas of high modernism through built work, theoretical writing, and relentless intellectual provocation. Their 1972 book, Learning from Las Vegas, had become a foundational text for postmodern theory, arguing that architects should embrace the messy vitality of the commercial vernacular rather than imposing abstract formal systems from above. The Seattle Art Museum was their chance to apply these ideas at a major civic scale, creating a building that would be simultaneously populist and sophisticated, contextual and monumental, serious and playful. The museum occupies a 5-story structure that contains roughly 150,000 square feet of space, including galleries, education facilities, administrative offices, storage, and a significant public lobby that functions as an urban room connecting the street to the museum's programs. The building's most recognizable feature is its limestone and painted steel facade, which presents a composition of carefully calibrated elements, an off-center entrance, a monumental staircase visible through glass, decorative bands and patterns, and a series of setbacks and projections that create a complex play of light and shadow across the street wall. To understand why the Seattle Art Museum looks the way it does, we need to step back and examine the broader cultural and architectural context of late 20th century America. By the early 1980s, when this project was being conceived, the modernist consensus that had dominated American architecture since the end of World War II was fraying badly. The glass boxes and concrete slabs that had seemed so progressive and rational in the 1950s and 60s were increasingly seen as cold, alienating, and disconnected from the specific histories and cultures of the places they occupied. Postmodernism emerged as both a critique and an alternative, drawing inspiration from historical precedent, vernacular building traditions, popular culture, and a renewed interest in meaning and communication in architecture. Venturi had fired one of the opening salvos of this movement with his 1966 book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which celebrated ambiguity, hybrid conditions, and the both-and rather than the either-or approach that characterized modernist thinking. Seattle itself was experiencing a significant transformation during this period, evolving from a regional port city dominated by Boeing and resource extraction industries into an increasingly cosmopolitan center of technology, culture, and international trade. The city was investing heavily in cultural infrastructure, recognizing that museums, theaters, and public spaces were essential components of urban vitality and economic competitiveness. The decision to commission Venturi and Scott Brown, architects with a national and international reputation, signaled Seattle's ambitions and its willingness to embrace architectural ideas that were sophisticated, intellectual, and somewhat controversial. The site itself presented both opportunities and challenges: a prominent downtown location with significant visibility, but also a steep grade, the need to integrate with existing urban fabric, and the requirement to create a civic presence that could hold its own among the commercial high-rises and older buildings that surrounded it. The design of the Seattle Art Museum is a masterclass in how postmodern architects approach the problem of creating institutional architecture that could be both monumental and accessible, historically informed and contemporary, contextual and distinctive. Let's start with the facade, which is where Venturi and Scott Brown's design philosophy becomes most immediately apparent. The building's primary street elevation along First Avenue presents a carefully composed wall that uses classical principles of hierarchy, proportion, and ornament, but applies them in ways that are subtly unconventional and knowing. The facade is clad primarily in limestone, a traditional material that connects the building to a long history of civic and cultural institutions, but the limestone is combined with painted steel elements, industrial-looking horizontal bands, and areas of glass that create a distinctly contemporary hybrid aesthetic. Near the top of the building, you'll notice decorative terracotta panels that reference both classical ornament and Native American design traditions, a gesture toward regional context that typifies Venturi and Scott Brown's interest in buildings that communicate meaning through symbolic references. The entrance is deliberately off-center, a move that would have horrified Beaux-Arts architects trained in classical symmetry, but which creates a more dynamic relationship between the building and the pedestrian flow along the sidewalk. Above the entrance, a monumental staircase rises through a multi-story glass volume, making the act of ascending into the museum a public spectacle visible from the street, an inversion of the typical museum model where entry sequences are hidden behind opaque walls. This transparency serves multiple purposes. It activates the street facade, demystifies the museum by revealing its interior workings, and creates a dramatic spatial experience that builds anticipation as visitors climb toward the galleries. The material palette throughout the building reflects Venturi and Scott Brown's interest in what they called ordinary, or conventional materials used in unexpected ways. Industrial flooring, painted steel, basic light fixtures, combined with more refined materials like the limestone and polished stone in the public spaces. Inside, the spatial organization is designed to balance the need for flexible, neutral gallery spaces with moments of architectural drama and orientation. The museum's collection spans multiple cultures and time periods, requiring galleries that could accommodate everything from contemporary paintings to African sculpture to Asian ceramics, and the architects responded with a relatively straightforward sequence of rectangular rooms that provide the blank backdrop curators desire, while preserving enough architectural character to prevent monotony. From a technical standpoint, the Seattle Art Museum represents a sophisticated integration of structural systems, building services, and architectural expression that merits close examination. The structural system is primarily reinforced concrete, chosen for its ability to span the museum's gallery spaces without intermediate columns, while providing the necessary load-bearing capacity for art storage and exhibition. The building steps down the steep grade of the site in a series of floor levels that follow the natural topography, minimizing excavation while creating a vertical sequence of spaces that visitors navigate through a combination of stairs, escalators, and elevators. This sectional strategy allows the building to present a 5-story facade to First Avenue while maintaining more modest proportions on the downhill side, mediating between the scale of downtown's high-rises and the lower buildings in the adjacent neighborhoods. Circulation is organized around the central grand staircase, which serves as both a practical means of moving between floors and a theatrical spatial event that reinforces the museum's civic identity. Unlike many modernist museums that hide circulation in back-of-house corridors or treat it as purely functional, Venturi and Scott Brown made movement through the building part of the architectural experience, creating moments where visitors can see across multiple levels, glimpse into galleries, and maintain orientation relative to the city outside. The lighting strategy varies by gallery type and collection requirements, with conservation-sensitive galleries receiving carefully controlled artificial illumination, while other spaces incorporate filtered natural light through skylights and high windows. The architects worked closely with museum professionals and lighting consultants to develop systems that could protect vulnerable artworks while creating the kind of varied, engaging spatial qualities that good museum lighting can provide. One of the more subtle technical achievements is how the building's mechanical and electrical systems are integrated into the architecture without overwhelming the visitor experience. No small feat in a museum where climate control and security systems are absolutely critical, but where visible infrastructure can destroy the contemplative atmosphere galleries require. The detailing throughout the building reflects Venturi and Scott Brown's philosophy that ornament and craft still have a place in contemporary architecture, but should be deployed selectively rather than used as all-over surface decoration. You'll find carefully designed door handles, elegant transitions between materials, and refined edge conditions that reveal an attention to how buildings are actually constructed and how people interact with architectural elements at close range. The reception of the Seattle Art Museum when it opened was mixed, reflecting the broader debates about postmodernism that were raging in architectural circles during the early 1990s. Critics sympathetic to Venturi and Scott Brown's approach praised the building for its contextual sensitivity, its rejection of modernist austerity, and its attempt to create a museum that felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Architecture journals published detailed analyses of the facade composition, the handling of the entry sequence, and the way the building negotiated its challenging urban site. Seattle residents, many of whom had watched the construction process with curiosity and skepticism, gradually warmed to the building as it became part of the city's cultural landscape, and as the museum's programs brought thousands of visitors downtown. The building received an American Institute of Architects Honor Award and was recognized in various publications as an important example of institutional architecture that took context, meaning, and public accessibility seriously. However, not everyone was convinced. Some critics felt the building was too timid, too compromised, not radical enough in its postmodern gestures. They wanted more irony, more color, more overt historical quotation. Others argued from the opposite direction, suggesting that the decorative elements were arbitrary, that the building was trying too hard to be liked, and that Venturi and Scott Brown had diluted their own theoretical positions in pursuit of client approval and public acceptance. Museum curators and directors had their own concerns, particularly about the gallery spaces, which some felt were too architecturally present, not neutral enough, insufficiently flexible for the constantly changing demands of contemporary exhibition practice. These critiques point to one of the central tensions in museum design: the balance between creating architecturally distinctive spaces that give an institution identity and character versus providing blank backgrounds that let the art speak for itself. Venturi and Scott Brown were always more interested in the former, believing that museums should be civic landmarks with strong architectural personalities, and the Seattle Art Museum definitely reflects that priority. Within the broader trajectory of Venturi and Scott Brown's career, the Seattle Art Museum occupies an interesting position. It came after their most theoretical and provocative work of the 1970s, but before some of their later institutional commissions, and it represents their attempt to synthesize populist accessibility with architectural sophistication at a significant scale. The building has become an integral part of Seattle's cultural identity, appearing in countless photographs, tourist guides, and civic representations of the city, and while it has been expanded and modified in subsequent years, including a major addition by Brad Clopefill's Allied Works Architecture that opened in 2007, the original Venturi and Scott Brown building remains the recognizable public face of the institution. So what can we learn from the Seattle Art Museum 3 decades after it opened, and why should architects and architecture students today care about this particular building? First, it reminds us that the debates about modernism and postmodernism, about ornament and abstraction, about meaning and form, are not settled historical questions, but ongoing concerns that every generation of architects must grapple with in their own terms. Venturi and Scott Brown's insistence that buildings should communicate, that architecture is a form of language that carries cultural meaning, remains relevant even if the specific vocabulary they employed feels dated to contemporary eyes. Second, the building demonstrates how architects can engage with difficult urban sites, steep grades, tight constraints, complex adjacencies, not as problems to be overcome through engineering heroics, but as opportunities to create buildings that respond to and enhance their specific locations. The way the Seattle Art Museum steps down its site, opens itself to the street, and creates a civic presence without resorting to bombastic gestures is a lesson in contextual design that transcends stylistic categories. Third, the project shows us the value of architectural ideas grounded in careful observation and analysis, rather than imposed from abstract theory. Venturi and Scott Brown spent years looking at how buildings actually work in cities, how people use and understand architecture, how historical precedent and vernacular traditions offer solutions to perennial design problems, And that research-based, empirically grounded approach to design remains a valuable model for practice. Finally, the Seattle Art Museum reminds us that architecture is a public art, that buildings shape civic life and cultural experience in ways that extend far beyond their immediate function, and that architects have a responsibility to create work that engages seriously with the communities and institutions they serve. Whether you love or hate postmodernism, whether you find Venturi and Scott Brown's design strategies compelling or frustrating, there's no denying that they took the social and cultural dimensions of architecture seriously, and that commitment to architecture as a civic practice deserves our attention and respect. If you found this deep dive into the Seattle Art Museum valuable, make sure to subscribe to UrbArchitect and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming episodes where we'll be exploring more buildings that challenge conventional wisdom and expand our understanding of what architecture can achieve. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about postmodernism, about Venturi and Scott Brown's work, or about museum architecture more generally. We love hearing from you, and your insights often spark ideas for future episodes. And if there's a particular building or architect you'd like us to cover, definitely let us know, because this channel exists to explore the buildings and ideas that matter to practicing architects and students who are serious about understanding the built environment at a deeper level. Until next time, keep looking up, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what architecture can be.